Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome everyone to the Center for Conflict and Humanitarian Studies. A warm welcome to the Excellencies who are attending this session with us in person today, and a very also warm welcome to all those who are following us online. And this session is being broadcasted live on Facebook and Twitter and various other facilities. My name is Sultan Barakat, and I'm the director of the Center for Conflict and Humanitarian Studies. And today I have the pleasure of sharing what I'm sure would be most interesting discussion around an issue that is not only timely but also extremely important to the context, particularly in the Arab world and the Muslim world. We shall be speaking about international humanitarian law, which is also known to some as the law of war or armed conflict, and we will be exploring some of the key dilemmas involved in the application and the understanding of the international humanitarian law in contemporary challenges in our region. To help us understand this better, we have lined up a fantastic panel who will share with us very practical experiences from a wide range of contexts from the Muslim and the Arab world. And we have been extremely fortunate to have also received a recorded message from the president of ICRC, Mr. Peter Morer, which we will use to kickstart our discussion. Immediately after the opening and the recorded message by the president of ICRC, we will engage in a more interactive panel, and we have four specialists. Each of them has been asked to look at IHL from a certain perspective, and I shall be introducing them as I invite them to speak. They're already listed in front of you on the screen here. And then we have the possibility of having a question and answer session. Those of you in the room, of course, you just need to raise your hand. And if you happen to follow us on Zoom or Facebook, please just write your question in the discussion panel, and my colleagues will send it to me, and I will address you to allow you to get your question. The IHL is basically a set of principles that have been agreed and accepted by nations and states, and goes back to the 1949 Geneva Conventions, but also has since then built on a number of other protocols and conventions that are related to the conduct of war. And in very short, and I will leave it to the specialist to explain in much more detail, I see it as the one tool that allows us to retain a measure of humanity during the most inhumane act of mankind, and that is war. So it has a very important dimension for protection, saving dignity, but very importantly, and maybe less explored, it allows for better opportunities for post-conflict recovery. And in our discussion today, we shall be looking at some of those issues. We will be looking at it within the context of our regional challenges. Particularly, I think, important has been, over the last 20 years, the war on terrorism and the way it has associated itself with Islam, the fact that conflict has spread in Muslim and Arab countries disproportionately, I think, over the last 20 years, is something that we should all keep in mind. 2 weeks ago, our center, in collaboration with the Peace Research Institute in Oslo, published a report that for the first time reviewed the Arab countries, and not MENA, not the Middle East, the Arab countries from 1947 until 2019. And if you can get hold of the report, I highly recommend it. It's a very good read, and it highlights a number of important trends One of them was the increase in number of conflicts. Another was the rise of non-state actors who do not necessarily believe and agree with the international principles most often. And also a very important trend is that in the Arab world, we seem for some reason or other attract intervention from outside. And when the world comes to resolve issues in our region, it tends to be trigger happy, and we jump a lot of potential in terms of diplomacy and move straight into confrontation. So all of this makes IHL incredibly important for us to understand and to be able to relate to it and to really find ways of rooting it within our local and regional culture. To help us do this, I'm extremely grateful for the support of the Swiss Embassy in Doha, who have helped work with us to organize this event and to sponsor it. I'm also grateful to our colleagues at ICRC, both in Geneva and in the regional office based in Kuwait, and their ambassador representative here in Doha. They've all pulled together to put this event for today, and I think it's a real honor for all of us to be associated with it. Our discussion is being translated simultaneously into Arabic, and we will be able to also get the questions translated simultaneously as they're presented. Before we go any further, I'd like to give the floor to my partner in organizing this event, a very good friend, Ambassador Edgar Dureg, who is the Ambassador of Switzerland to Qatar. Ambassador.
Thank you very much, Sultan Barakat. Excellencies, honored guests, Assalamu alaikum. It brings me great joy to welcome you all here at the Doha Institute for Graduate Studies for this promising symposium on contemporary dilemmas in international humanitarian law, with a special focus on the Arabic and Islamic world. I want to thank all our project partners for their excellent cooperation, the honored panelists for their sure to be enlightening speeches and contributions, as well as our esteemed guests here in Doha and connected with us online for joining this event. It has been co-organized by the Center for Conflict and Humanitarian Studies, the International Committee of the Red Cross, and the Embassy of Switzerland in Qatar. 2 years ago, Swiss diplomatic missions around the world planned to celebrate the 70 years anniversary of the 4 Geneva Conventions of 12 August 1949. As you know, celebrations were cut a bit short due to the pandemic. All the more we're happy to realize this event here tonight with you. The Geneva Conventions represent the core of international humanitarian law, IHL, and are born in Switzerland. They were drafted by states in Geneva under the auspices of our government and the guidance of the then Federal Councillor and Minister of Foreign Affairs, Max Petit-Pierre. Geneva, the city which gave its name to the convention, is the global hub for humanitarian efforts. It is also home to the custodian of IHL, the ICRC, co-founded by Swiss citizens Henri Dunant in 1863. The humanitarian principles of humanity, impartiality, neutrality, and independence are reflected in IHL, including in the Geneva Conventions. These fundamental principles not only guide the ICRC and West-Crescent movement based in Geneva, but also the work of the Swiss Humanitarian Aid. IHL is a set of rules which establish minimum standards of humanity that must be respected in any situation of armed conflict. Their authors aim to abolish the concept of total war as witnessed during the Second World War. IHL restricts means and methods of warfare and ensures the protection and humane treatment of persons who are not or no longer participating in the hostilities. In short, when war occurs, it must be conducted in the most humane manner possible, balancing military necessity and humanity. The Geneva Conventions are the most ratified international instruments. Every single state of the world has accepted to be bound by them, and on their basis, millions of lives have been saved over the past 72 years. This is an encouraging reminder that all states can, should, and must come together for the good humanity. Indeed, the Geneva Conventions are a success story of multilateralism. However, while the Geneva Conventions marked a milestone in the regulation of armed conflicts and are generally respected, too many violations still occur. Symposia like this shed light on the importance of adhering to IHL and represent an opportunity for states to continuously renew their commitment to a common humanity and to ensure the respect of IHL. To conclude, let me thank a few of our partners. First and foremost, Sherin Polini, ICRC Head of Mission in Qatar, for excellent work she's doing in Doha and for fostering IHL. Thanks, of course, also to her colleagues from the ICRC in Kuwait, as well as to Professor Sultan Barakat and his team at the Center for Conflict and Humanitarian Studies for jointly making this symposium happen. Our collaboration will continue for another month. The Swiss Agency for Development and Cooperation, SDC, in cooperation with ICRC and the Musée de l'Élysée in Lausanne, Switzerland, have launched an international art exhibition entitled Humanitarian Principles Here and Now. In the spirit of this symposium, the exhibition will be featured here in Doha at the Fire Station Art in Residence from 21st September to 19th of October. We are looking forward to welcoming you there very soon. Excellencies, colleagues and honored guests, I wish you now a fruitful and stimulating symposium and hand over the word to my former superior, kind colleague at the Swiss Ministry of Foreign Affairs and now President of the ICRC, His Excellency Dr. Peter Maurer, for his keynote speech recorded. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. For those of you who do not know Peter Maurer, he was, before becoming the president of ICRC in 2012, he was the Secretary of State for Foreign Affairs for Switzerland for almost 2 years, and before that he served in many senior diplomatic missions of Switzerland around the world and in New York. Unfortunately, today, because of the restrictions on travel, and also we happen to be competing with the UN General Assembly meetings, he is not able to be with us, and there's an issue with the timing, so the message is recorded, or pre-recorded, and we shall play it now. Please go ahead.
Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it's a pleasure to address you in this virtual symposium. I commend the organizers and hosts, particularly Professor Sultan Barakat and Ambassador Edgar Dörig, for this initiative and for your contribution to promoting respect for international humanitarian law. Initiatives such as this panel and the upcoming art installation provide an opportunity to reflect on the power of humanitarian principles and IHL to preserve humanity in deadly conflicts. Such reminders are timely, especially with the ongoing conflicts in the region, the latest being the events in Afghanistan, which show us how quickly conflict dynamics can change. I have just returned from a 4-day visit to Afghanistan. There, I was able to meet with the Taliban leadership to discuss ICRC's plans to scale our operations in response to massive humanitarian needs. The events of recent weeks underscore how critical it is to have principled humanitarian actors win the trust of authorities and populations through neutrality and partiality and international humanitarian law. Globally, in today's conflicts, the ICRC is challenged by a convergence of complex and interlinked factors. In this region, this includes critical issues on the protection of civilians such as urban warfare, protracted conflicts, terrorism and counterterrorism measures, the rise of non-state armed groups, the impacts of climate change, and adapting to global pandemics such as COVID-19. Additionally, advancing technologies are creating new front lines in cyberspace and producing new ways to fight, for example, autonomous weapon systems and remote technologies. These newer features of conflict are posing additional challenges for the region. International humanitarian law must continuously respond to these new challenges. In doing so, it does not ask the impossible. It is founded on a realistic set of rules that strike a balance between military necessity and humanity. It therefore remains a key and indispensable tool for states to deal with contemporary challenges of conflicts, including counterterrorism, operations in armed conflict. Every single day, IHL is at work saving lives and protecting women, men, and children in conflicts around the world. We rightly hear about the violations because the consequences are tragic and visible. But we must also recognize the protective power and positive impacts when the law is respected. Some of these examples will be highlighted by our panelists today and in the upcoming art installation. Through 160 years of work, the ICRC has seen the behaviors of belligerents to better respect international humanitarian law is critical to protect civilians. For this to happen, the starting point for states is to bring IHL home. This means to consider ratifying or acceding to IHL treaties, to integrate into domestic law IHL treaties to which a state is a party, and to integrate IHL obligations into military training and doctrine. Therefore, besides humanitarian assistance, the ICRC continues to work with states and others on the application of IHL in contemporary battlefields in the Middle East and worldwide. For example, the ICRC works with states on the ratification of numerous IHL treaties, on the adoption of national legislation to integrate IHL domestically, and on the capacity building and the training of personnel from relevant ministries. This year alone, the ICRC held training sessions with the Ministry of Defense of Qatar, Kuwait, Egypt, Syria, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, and others. We particularly appreciate the ongoing constructive dialogue and cooperation with many states and non-state armed groups from the region. This includes holding numerous confidential discussions held with relevant parties to the conflict or parties of influence relating to the application of IHL. The fruitful collaboration with the League of Arab States, the Organization of Islamic Cooperation and the Gulf Cooperation Council, and the ongoing cooperation with the various Arab national committees on international humanitarian law. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, the ICRC works to be a pragmatic partner for all those who can reduce suffering in conflict. We will continue to deliver humanitarian assistance and protection services, support states in the application of IHL, and hold confidential dialogue with parties to the conflict and actors of influence. Through humanitarian action, through respect for international humanitarian law, and through our shared humanity, we can together improve the lives of millions around the globe. I thank you.
I'd like to thank Mr. Peter Morer for this uplifting speech or intervention with us today. It is really important, I think, to remember the role of ICRC throughout the last 50, 60, 70 years now since the IHL has been put into place. Their role is enshrined in the Geneva Convention, and they have bravely carried their responsibility day after day, conflict after conflict, non-stop practically. And those of you who are following the movement and the committee's work will also acknowledge the fact that they've lost many colleagues in conflict as a result of trying to create that humane space in the midst of war. And I particularly noted from the speech the reference to the visit to Kabul and the meeting is held with the Taliban. I think it's an important issue to draw attention to because of the distinction between recognition of non-actors, which is now very much the debate between the states as to whether they would recognize Taliban as a government, and the ability to communicate, the ability to create a contact with them so that the benefit to the civil community is there. This and many other aspects will be the subject of our panel discussion, and we are going to start. Okay, I bring it too close, it starts making an echo. To start our debate and to delve into greater depth into some of these issues, we've chosen 4 sub-themes, all related to the application of IHL, and obviously they're all interrelated, but we thought by addressing each of them by a single expert or an academic, we will be able to see greater insights and then maybe have a discussion around those themes. We shall start with a discussion on the issue of women and IHL, and then move to Islam and IHL, and then the growing phenomena of arming children in war. And finally, we will bring it together by highlighting some of the more general contemporary dilemmas facing the application of IHL in the Arab and Muslim world. To start with, let me introduce our first speaker, Dr. Helen Durham. Dr. Durham is the Director of International Law and Policy at ICRC and has served in this position since 2014. She has over 20 years of experience in the Red Cross and Red Crescent movement and has been a legal advisor to ICRC delegation in a number of countries, and headed the office of ICRC in Australia and played various senior roles within the Australian Red Cross movement. She holds a PhD in international humanitarian law and international criminal law and is now a senior fellow at Melbourne University School of Law. Welcome, Helen. We'll give you 10 to 15 minutes for your intervention, and we will come back to the discussion after the other speakers have had a chance to also share their thoughts. Over to you, Helen.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Appreciate it. It's a great privilege, Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, to be able to join you here today as a panelist. It's always a pity that I can't be there in person, but we make the best of how we can, and it's a delight to be part of this important panel, and thank you very much for the organisers for this timely symposium. Now, the President just then mentioned in his keynote a number of important challenges in the region related to respect for IHL that have very far-reaching and, let's be honest, heartbreaking implications for the population living in the region. What I wish to re-emphasise is the long-standing history of the formulation and the development of international humanitarian law, IHL, in which many nations, including from the region, have played a key role, and to which their contribution and their ideas about their own heritage, military practices, and values about protecting those who no longer participate in hostilities have made IHL the rich, universal heritage which we have today. It's a body of norms that are universally recognised as the minimum standard, almost the minimum safety net for people in armed conflict. Now, as the Chair graciously advised, I've been asked to particularly focus on the issue of women and IHL. And there's 3 things I wish to highlight. The first one is a few moments spent on the different impact that armed conflict has on different people, on women and girls and on men and boys. The second one is sort of technically on what IHL specifically has to say about the protection of women in armed conflict and how it accounts for their needs. And the third relates to the role of women in armed conflict and the aftermath of armed conflict. So in doing so, what I really want to highlight today is some of the ongoing work of the ICRC, which we're doing to adapt our interpretations of the IHL norms to the contemporary realities of warfare, as well as the need for us to invest more in understanding how IHL and a range of other bodies of law, and this includes Islamic law, interface and offer protection to people affected by armed conflict, and in this case, specifically women. Now, as you said, there'll be a distinct intervention on IHL and Islamic law by another speaker, so I won't delve into this important aspect in detail. But let's look at women for a moment in armed conflict. Now, women are often placed at the epicenter of conflict, and they're endangered not only because of their proximity to fighting, but also because they can be deliberately targeted as a tactic or strategy of war. In addition, they risk bodily injury and sexual violence, but war also compromises their access to healthcare, can result in the displacement of women, affect their ability to have access to safe drinking water and food, and often reduces girls' access to education. And around the world, we in ICRC also observe how the new dynamics of violence are taking a very heavy toll on the lives of women and men, girls and boys every day. And the President also mentioned the protracted nature of conflict and the urbanized nature of conflict, where we not only see individuals killed and maimed, but the destruction of infrastructure and economies. And we really know that women are being and will continue to be disproportionately affected as the cities around them crumble and their access to basic services is destroyed. Now, when it comes to the conduct of hostilities, we observe a number of interesting trends. First one is that a large proportion of civilians killed or injured in the conduct of hostilities are women and girls. And this is often because women and girls are responsible for the care of children and older relatives. And hence, the situation of fleeing or running from actual or impending attacks is more difficult. And this may be one reason why I see a large proportion of women and girls as victims, be it after the aftermath of bombings, shelling, landmines, or explosive remnants of war. The second issue we need to raise is that when male family members are killed, female-headed households can face real barriers in accessing income to support their families. And we see a lot of poverty in female-headed households during and after armed conflict. Another issue is the fatality rate and percentage of lifelong disabilities, such as amputations, has been documented to be higher amongst women in some contexts. And this is partly due to the fact that women may have reduced access to healthcare for cultural, religious, or purely military reasons, such as there's a treatment reserved or privileged for combatants. And finally, it's important to highlight that certain weapons can have direct gendered impacts because of biology. So it's not something we think enough about, but we do know, for example, that the research indicates that women store a greater degree of toxicity from toxic remnants of war that come from conventional ammunition. So that just touches on a few issues when we look at the impact of conflict on women. Now let's for a moment now turn to IHL. So as many of you may know, this branch of law regulates how armed conflict is fought. And as such, its rules address the conduct of hostilities and general protection of civilians, including by addressing the specific risks faced by women in armed conflict. Now, in a nutshell, these rules prohibit discrimination in the treatment of women, including by requiring that due regard be given to the specific needs of women. Now, here's a few examples from the important treaties. So, for example, women who are deprived of their liberty must be given separate courts from men, and they must be directly supervised by female guards. At the same time, women members of the armed forces shall be given due regard and provided with medical care required by their state of health and benefit from equal treatment alongside men prisoners of war. There is also a range of special rules intended to provide for the needs of pregnant women and mothers of young children, and these include medical treatment, additional food proportional to needs, and free passage of consignments, and special rules in detention. And finally, it's important to highlight that rape and other forms of sexual violence are prohibited and constitute war crimes in armed conflict, whether they're committed against women or men or girls or boys. It's a prohibition. Now, states must criminalise rape and other forms of sexual violence committed during and in connection with armed conflict within their domestic legal systems, as the President talked about, the need to domesticate these laws. And states also have an obligation to investigate and prosecute or extradite perpetrations of such crimes. Now, besides such IHL, of course, there are other branches of international law and even different legal systems which may be relevant to look at when we discuss the protection of women in armed conflict more broadly. And these, of course, can include human rights law, refugee law, and, as I mentioned before, significantly Islamic law, which is one of obviously the three key legal systems in the world, which also provides specific guidance on the protection of women in times of armed conflict and shares many of the same humanitarian objectives as IHL. In fact, my understanding, and certainly those of the wonderful experts I have in my department, is that under Islamic law, women constitute one of the 5 categories of people which are specifically mentioned in the hadith of Prophet Muhammad as examples of civilians protected from attack, alongside with children, the elderly, clergy, and usafa. Now, I have been informed, my experts advise me that the word usafa means in the context that anyone who is hired to do services to the enemy in the battlefield, but not engaged in hostilities, such as contractors in today's context. So, as is the case for civilians under IHL, members of these categories will, of course, lose their protection from attack if they directly take part in hostilities. And in a similar way, many of the other more general rules of IHL, which protect victims of armed conflict, such as the guarantee of humane treatment, especially as it relates to detainees, the protection of civilians and civilian facilities and properties, and the limitations on the methods and means of warfare, are likewise found in Islamic law and rules of war developed by Muslim jurists since the 7th and 8th centuries onwards. So there was a proud and long history in this regard. Finally, as I mentioned, I wanted to highlight the important role of women in armed conflict and the fact that IHL provides specific protection to women and girls. The fact that it does provide that in no way distracts from the fact that we see across the globe the remarkable resilience and capacities in situations of armed conflict. And let me say a few words about this. Of course, women, as we know, are not just passive victims in armed conflict. This notion or this idea inaccurately reflects women's actual role, which is much more varied. Women are fighters, they're breadwinners, they're survivors, they're leaders in their communities. They find themselves having to overcome appalling suffering while holding together and rebuilding their community. And as you know, the number of women serving in contemporary armed conflict and armed forces today continues to grow, as does the number of women involved in brokering peace or managing conflict. And perhaps one area I might like to briefly highlight where women's voices must be heard, it relates to the search for missing persons. And the majority of people who go missing in contemporary armed conflict are sadly men, which has devastating psychological, economic, and social impacts on their families. And it is often women, the mothers, the sisters, the grandmothers, the wives, who are at the front of the search for those who are missing and acknowledge the memory and fight for justice. And I really wanted to mention this example and acknowledge the courage, strength, and solidarity of many of these associations, which are often represented by women. And just for a moment, on a personal note, I was very fortunate as a young ICRC delegate to spend time in Aceh back in the early 2000s, where I was disseminating international humanitarian law to many groups. And I was really humbled to learn about the amazing contributions of women to Islamic civilizations in many examples across the history. And in fact, when I left Aceh, I was presented with a very large knife. It was rather scary, that I was told by the military that this was a knife traditionally used by Aceh female warriors who were fighting against the Dutch and the Portuguese many decades ago. So I think it's really important, and as I said, I'm often humbled to understand the role that women play in many different contexts. So having outlined the impact of armed conflict on women, their role as actors in armed conflict, and the protections to which they're entitled to under IHL, the question remains, what is it that we can concretely do looking ahead? And of course, in this space, there is always a lot to do. At the ICRC, we have committed to improving our understanding of gender and IHL going forward. And we recently convened an expert meeting to prepare a report which aims at understanding the different applications and implications of IHL obligations on diverse groups of men, women, girls and boys. So through our proximity on the ground to people affected by armed conflict, we're also committed to pay very close attention to the realities the communities themselves experience, rather than making assumptions on their behalf for their humanitarian needs. And this helps us understand more precisely how different groups of women experience armed conflict and violence. And this type of work is essential for us to deliver ultimately on our mandate, which is to reduce suffering during times of armed conflict. What we know is that IHL can have a positive and multiplying impact when it's respected. And on this, may I flag, what IHL respects means for women in a summary is that detained women are treated humanely and given due respect. That civilian women can access humanitarian relief and medical care without discrimination. That indirect effects of the conduct of hostilities on civilians, including specific effects on women, are factored in to military decision-making, and that sexual violence is criminalized and prevented. These are just a few examples. Now, in conclusion, I did want to circle back to what our President, Mr. Maurer, alluded to in his opening remarks. IHL is the minimal safety net for our humanity in the most extreme circumstances that have been of war. And here I would like to tell you that IHL is something worth investing in, especially in a region such as the Middle East, whose people have suffered consecutive cycles of violence for decades. Why? Because preventing violations of the kind we see today is not only humane, but it's less costly than addressing the human, social, economic, mental health toll of these wars that can affect entire generations. So it's only through our joint commitment that we can make progress and secure long-term respect for humanity, which is of benefit to all participants in our societies, including women. The ICRC, as always, remains committed to supporting states in fulfilling their obligations, including through the dissemination of provisions of IHL and lending technical expertise to support states integrate the relevant provisions into their domestic legal framework. It was a great honour to have this moment to address you, and I look forward to the rest of the program. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Durham. Thank you also for emphasizing that it's not just women being affected disproportionately more than men, but they also play a very important active role in society, in building the norms and in building those principles that we all aspire to. We also recognize that women could also be combatants, and they might find themselves at the receiving end of being taken prisoners, investigated, etc., etc. So all of this is important for our coming discussion, and it is extremely fitting that the next speaker is Ms. Fatima Gailani. Ms. Fatima Gailani is one of those exceptional Afghan women who's done a great deal to her country and I would say to the world as well over many, many decades of practice. Fatima may have entered history today as the first Afghan woman to fly into Kabul. She just arrived. She was here this morning in Qatar, and against the current of fleeing the city, she has made the very brave decision to go back to Kabul to be able to lead from within and to affect change from within, as she has done for many decades. Mrs. Gailani obtained a BA and an MA in Persian literature and Sufism from the National University of Iran. And later on, in 1994, she obtained an MA in Islamic Studies from the Muslim College in London. She lived much of her life, early life, in exile as a young woman, and was the first spokesperson, female spokesperson on behalf of the Mujahideen during the days of jihad against the Soviet occupation. Following the invasion of Afghanistan in 2001 and the fall of the Taliban, she became a member of the Bonn Conference, and in 2003 she played a very important role as a commissioner in forming the Afghan Constitution of 2004, and in particular emphasizing the role of women within that constitution. Since 2004 until recently, she served as the president of the Afghan Red Crescent Society, and through that role, she was, and still is, I think, one of the very few people in Afghanistan who is able to speak to absolutely everyone and maintain contact to help the most vulnerable. Mrs. Gailani, the floor is yours. I think you're muted, Fatima.
Sorry. Thank you very much. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Sultan, I almost didn't recognize me the way you introduced me. It's an honor to be here, and I'm back home. And back tomorrow, I will have a visit from my Afghan Red Crescent Society colleagues. So back to normal life. Sultan, for me, IHL is a memory that stayed with me from childhood and then continued. At that time, I didn't know what IHL is or what to become of IHL later. I remember on the 4th grade, I was studying the first jihad of the Muslims, when Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and his disciples, they went to the first war. And as a child, when I was listening to my teacher and reading that he was so careful about everything, so my prophet became more and more dear to me and more important to me. That, as you said it earlier, about women, about pregnant women, about elders, about trees, about clean water, about farms, about the place of worship of others, not to disrespect. And for me, I thought, oh my God, this person had to be a prophet, because if in a war that he was a victim and he thought of so many things, I was feeling an utter pride. Then, of course, I took it for granted that this was the teaching of the Muslims, and a war has to be conducted. First, we should not have a war, but if it is must, then it has to have this framework, and we should not break the boundaries. Many, many years after that, when I was a young volunteer in the Afghan Red Crescent Society, we also touched upon these things, and I was feeling extremely privileged and important to go and teach this to the children younger than me. And we wanted all this to be part of the curriculum of the schools, that I still believe that it should be. It should be engraved in the heart and in the mind of everybody. No matter what profession they take later, it has to be within them when they work. But much, much later, in my in my early 50s, when I became the president of the Afghan Red Crescent Society, and I was sent to Geneva for leadership courses of 2 weeks, and there the whole thing refreshed. And when I was reading, when I was taught about IHL, I said, okay, I remember myself as a child again that I was so proud. And here I'm so proud to see that these teaching actually exists in my own religion. And it was explained to people and explained to the warriors long, long before that we knew what IHL would be and how important it would be. Saying all this, I lived in a country that I was 24-year-old when the war started. I'm very soon I'm approaching my 70s in a few years' time. And we are still suffering, and still IHL as an important thing, because I can see that how easily the rules of war can be broken. It can be broken in a way that mending it and healing it sometimes is absolutely impossible. And to stay and make people suffer and deep scars for all men and women, and especially for women and for children. That's why I feel that this is very important, that we refresh the memory of everybody, whether they are in the army, whether they are on the other important positions, that this is an important thing. And especially for Muslims, this is a must. This is a must because this is one of the early teaching of our Prophet, peace be upon him, that emphasized about it. And now that it has become an international law, so much better. We must not look at it as an alien and Western thing. We should look at it that this is legalization and internationalization of something that we started more than 1,400 years ago. So that's the way we should see it. That's why it is important that it is not only taught to the combatants or to soldiers, that it has to go to the curriculum of the school, and it has to be engraved in the heart and minds of people. Afghanistan has started another page, a new page. This page has to be helped. That will be end of the wars, end of the civil wars, or any kind of wars. That's why, again, this becomes extremely important. These young men that today from airport to home I saw in the streets, they can easily learn this. Maybe if not in the framework of IHL, but they have to learn it in the bounds of religion. And people with a gun in their hand, that how the fighter became. That's why it is important that we renew it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Fatma. And again, thank you for emphasizing that many of those principles are not necessarily imported to us, but they've risen from our own religion and culture. And the real challenge is how we embed them into people's minds as early as possible. So taking it to the schools, educating soldiers, discussing those subjects is very important on a day-to-day basis. And with this, I move to our next speaker, someone who has been working on this for some time and has really made important contributions, Dr. Fauzi Sadiq. He's a world-known expert on the subject of international humanitarian law. He's a member of the National Committee of International Humanitarian Law here in Qatar and the president of the Islamic Forum on International Humanitarian Law, which is part of the OIC. He heads the International Cooperation and International Humanitarian Law Department at Qatar Red Crescent. And for those of you who do not know, I think the Qatar Red Crescent made a very important contribution a few years ago when it published the first book on Islam and international humanitarian law. And that remains one of the most important work in this area. Before joining Qatar Red Crescent, Dr. Fauzi was the Dean of the Faculty of Law at the University of Blida in Algeria, and he has several publications. I will just mention the introduction to international humanitarian law that is done while he was in Algeria. Dr. Fauzi, the floor is yours. And Dr. Fauzi will be exploring the issue of arming children in conflict.
سأتكلم باللغة العربية. شكرا. إذا بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. بداية
In the name of God, the most merciful, the most compassionate, first of all, I would like to thank Professor Sultan Barakat and His Excellency Ambassador Edgar, and my warm greetings to Dr. Lan, Mr. Makki, and I'm particularly pleased to find out that Ms. Fatma Jailani is here with us. This was a good opportunity. I was looking forward to meeting her a long time ago. My greetings from Doha to you in Kabul, and by the will of God, we will all succeed in our tasks. I will try to compete with the Swiss watch here and not to go beyond the time allocated to me of 15 minutes, although I find that rather difficult. I have lots of things to talk about. One of the most important things, maybe our colleague spoke about women, maybe I should speak then about children. These children whose rights are usually violated in a grave manner, and these violations are more often than not done in a systematic way, which according to the Roma Statute can be or can amount to crimes against humanity or war crimes. Before I start, I have a rather philosophical and existential question to pose. I wonder, despite the Hague system and the Geneva system and the Roma Statute, why then these violations not only continue, but according to many statistics by the UNICEF or the ICRC or the International Labour Organization, they may be even on the increase. So despite the obligations enshrined in these treaties, the question persists. Are the continued violations a result of the weakness in the system itself and these mechanisms, or are these treaties now suffering from a defect or a disease, so therefore the immunity system in them is weakened, and therefore taking them as points of reference is no longer that viable? We want to understand. We want guarantees and assurances for children. So therefore, from this academic platform, this question, this existential question, the reply to it is not in the corridors of law as much as they are in the corridors of power and politics. Unfortunately, the international humanitarian law, and some may agree or disagree with me on this, gets the flu, and this flu is apparent in 2 points. First, the politicization of the international humanitarian law, and Fatima Al-Jailani has alluded to the importance of the educational system, and also these principles are part and parcel of a Muslim's article of faith or system of belief. Yet sometimes some people are either weakened or they lose the willpower to implement these principles. So therefore I will, in view of this philosophical question, I'll talk about arming or militarizing children, or these, in fact, grave and blatant violations of children's innocence. Abu Hamid al-Ghazali, a well-known Islamic scholar, describes children or a child as a gem that should be protected and valued. Before we delve into any analysis, we must try to give some definitions of what we mean by childhood or child according to 1989 agreement or the African Charter on the Rights of Children or the International Criminal Court's literature. They determine the age of childhood from 0 to 18 years, and also the International Criminal Court does not does not consider cases of people on personal basis below the age of 18. So therefore, with reference to the 4 Geneva protocols or conventions, spoke in more detail. Sometimes they allude to children as below the age of 7 or infants or beyond the age of 18. But by and large, the majority of these agreements that compulsory work or death sentences should not be passed or given against children if they are forced into armed service or volunteer to do so. For this reason, the 4 Geneva protocols considers them as civilians who are not engaged in belligerent acts, and also they consider them as vulnerable, and we appreciate really the role played by the ICRC and also some of the norms established, like which stipulates that children who are harmed as a result of an armed conflict deserve respect and protection in a special way or particular way. But going back to the 1989 agreement onwards, we will find that the scope of protection has been expanded, not in the internal conflicts and conflicts only, but to internal acts of violence and in reference also to many practices, judicial practices, and especially with some hybrid courts like the Sierra Leone or Congo, we find that they all try to protect children from armed service. Maybe of late we started hearing of some armed conflicts where we started hearing about child soldiers, and the Rome Statute considers that every entity or group, armed group or state, whether recognized or not recognized, recruits children as fighting soldiers. This may amount to a war crime. For this reason, one of the innovations of the ICRC in a book entitled Children at War, this phenomena of recruiting children is expanding. They become cooks, they become porters, they become scouts, they become also they are violated sexually, or they're forced into forced labor, or they are forced to carry out suicide missions or act as messengers or clear minefields. For this reason, they call them children embedded or attached to armed forces or armed groups. Now that we have talked about recruiting or militarizing these children, what kind of legal protection is there that can be provided to these children if they are forced into armed service, or they are attracted through different means of luring them into such kind of practices? Referring back to the Geneva protocols, we will find that they ban recruiting children below the age of 15 or taking part in any acts of belligerence or armed service. And also the 1989 agreement on children also goes in this direction, whether in international or local conflicts, and also the additional protocols of other conventions. I don't have time to go into much detail, but they restricted the age for compulsory and mandatory armed service for enlisting in the armies or for armed groups, and also referring back to the International Labour Organization. It also spoke about recruiting children to work against the norms and standards respected in the world, and so have many recommendations from the international humanitarian movement. I might be by that, I mean the ICRC or the Red Crescent or other such organizations, and we can refer to the 1993 recommendations in this regard. Also, by referring to the international practices, and by that I mean a lot of outcomes from courts and sentences handed down, they or rulings, they considered that such acts will be considered as war crimes or crimes against humanity, and the CAP standards by the UN Organization on Children, which considers any person who is below the age of 18 cannot be forced into joining armed forces, whether regular or regular armed groups or irregular armed groups. Finally, faced with this situation, what are the solutions? In my estimation, avoiding politicizing this kind of action or to avoid double standards, there are mechanisms. By that I mean Article 90 of the Geneva Convention, which stipulates that a committee, a fact-finding committee, should be established, and this started in 1991 when the quorum was reached by 21 countries. Now it has more than 77 countries. This committee can act as a safety valve against these violations. The other mechanism, which is still under establishment and under the Red Cross, and maybe I can address His Excellency the Ambassador here, is to come up with some sort of an assessment and evaluation of how successful the international humanitarian law has been so far. This is, of course, subject of long-going debate within the international humanitarian movement and the ICRC.
Thank you very much, Fauzi, for drawing attention to the very important aspect of child combatants, which I think it is a particular problem in our region and has become more so in the last maybe 10 years or so. It's also interesting to note the protocols that were signed in the year 2000. Would be maybe in the discussion we come back to talk as to how many Arab countries have signed up to those protocols and what specifically can be done to raise awareness amongst the non-state combatants and movements in our region. And to help us bring a lot of those issues together, we move to our fourth and last speaker, Dr. Omar Makki. Dr. Omar Makki is the Regional Legal Coordinator for the Middle East and North Africa on behalf of ICRC, and he's based in Kuwait. He joined ICRC in 2011, and those of you who follow social media will probably recognize him as the promoting face of ICRC in the Arab world. He's very active on social media and very active in carrying the message of IHL. Between 2005 and 2012, he served as a public prosecutor in Egypt, and also worked on the investigation team that went to Bahrain, or part of the Bahrain Independent Commission of Inquiry. Before that, he served as a judge for primary courts, and he holds a degree in law from Alexandria University and a postgraduate diploma in international criminal law from Salzburg School of Law, and a PhD in international law from the Graduate Institute of International and Development Studies in Geneva. Thank you very much, Omar, for joining us. Over to you.
I would like to thank you, Dr. Sultan Barakat. It gives me great pleasure to participate in this symposium at the behest of the Arab Center and the Embassy of Switzerland in Qatar. Within 15 minutes, I would like to share with you some of the phenomena that related to the armed conflicts in the Middle East, the challenges thereby in the application of IHL in the region. The first phenomenon that I would like to share with you, perhaps it's outside the normative framework of the IHL, but it is pertinent to it, i.e. the burgeoning power to try to have conclusive triumph or victory. And I'm talking here about the UN Charter that incriminates the use of force on the part of the states, save Article 42, i.e. the Security Council's interference to protect peace and security, and Article number 51, pertinent to defending oneself or self-defense. In the Middle East, we have rampant conflicts, but the Security Council, as a matter of fact, following certain socio-economic circumstances, could not resort to certain resolutions to protect peace and security. 1973 in 2011 was the only resolution that is pertinent to Libya. But because of the political polarizations and because of the division within the 5 permanent members of the Security Council, this had led to certain vacuum, especially when it comes to passing resolutions. And thus the conflicts have increased. Indeed, Article 51 has been interpreted loosely, especially as far as self-defense is concerned. There is also the preemptive use of power in accordance with international criminal law has been utilized in Iraq in 2003, and other kind of theories that defend self-defense following the Arab Springs, or the so-called Arab Spring, especially what took place in Iraq and Syria. So we've seen recently a remarkable increase in conflicts to settle the scores. And I've started with this phenomenon because I believe in a quotation in Nuremberg 1945 ruling that says the crime of aggression contains within itself the accumulated evil of the whole. That means, obviously he said it in English and he's interpreting what he said in Arabic now. So without utilizing aggression from one state against another, we wouldn't have ended with such violations like crimes against humanity, genocide, and war crimes. So I just wanted to allude to this phenomenon in the first place. Armed conflicts lead ultimately to the violation of international law and the IHL. The second phenomenon, and it is pertinent also to the challenges posed against the IHL, and it is to do with the complications of the conflicts themselves. Unfortunately, IHL does not define arms conflicts. It talks about international arms conflict and non-international arms conflicts and other phenomena. And as a matter of fact, any person or any counselor or any legal advisor must define conflicts. Is it international? Is it non-international? Or is it to do with certain tumultuous times or chaos or so on and so forth? Because every single case is pertinent to certain legislative framework. In the Middle East, in the Arab Islamic world, by and large, this region has witnessed certain peculiarities as far as the definitions are concerned. The most common model is having armed groups supported by external powers with arms and funds to continue their battles, fighting the regular armies in the same country. And here, if the regular army wants to perpetuate its efforts, also seeks help from the external powers. So here, there is a hybrid kind of model. Armed groups supported by external powers, as well as the national armies also supported by external powers. So it seems like a surrogate kind of war, but it is not, because it is more complicated. The third phenomenon relates to the battleground, and this is a novelty in the Middle East, especially following the so-called the Arab Spring. The scene is as follows. Wars take place inside cities. Urban warfare, Henry Demas talked about this issue in 1859, but this is a totally different kettle of fish. Here we're talking about violating the IHL, especially when it comes to proportionate, to be proportional, as well as the discrimination, to discriminate between militants or combatants and civilians. So these two kind of solid foundations of the IHL have been violated, proportionality and discrimination, the two basic pillars of the IHL. It has become very difficult for the regular armies and the armed groups to respect this principle within the cities or in the urban areas. So the battleground has become different and it has imposed different challenges. Here we are not talking about discrimination, we're talking about proportionality as well. To a certain extent, most of the parties to the conflict do incorporate armed groups, and thus they are inside the cities and they are overlapping with the populace on the civilians. So it is very difficult for any armed groups to differentiate between the civilians and the combatant, and thus this would lead to chaos, and this would lead to casualties amongst the civilians, and civilians might be actually utilized as human shields. We have seen human shields in a number of cities. We have seen leveling siege on a number of cities or blockade. Indeed, leveling or imposing blockade on the civilians is prohibited. Different arms have been used, like explosive munitions. It is permissible in warfare, but it is not in the urban areas. There's a fourth phenomenon that is pertinent to contemporary armed conflicts, and it is to do with the exaggerated dissemination of non-state actors. There is a report from the ICRC stipulates the fact that during the last 7 years we have witnessed the emergence of non-state actors in comparison with 70 years. So we can compare the 7 years with 7 decades of the past in numbers. We have two problems here. The first problem relates to what's called access to liaise with them and to facilitate humanitarian aid and so on and so forth. And the second issue is to do with providing access and liaising with these groups to apply the IHL on the part of the ICRC and other humanitarian organizations. Unfortunately, some states are skeptics when it comes to such link between the armed groups and the ICRC or other humanitarian organizations. And that's why the ICRC tries to build confidence with the states in order to liaise with the armed groups. But even if the state or the government agrees, we encounter another challenge, which is the acceptance by the armed groups to liaise with us. We have witnessed assaults targeting individuals of the ICRC and other humanitarian organizations because of certain perceptions and certain stereotype kind of thinking vis-a-vis the agendas of the ICRC and the other humanitarian organizations and NGOs. There's another challenge as far as dealing with the armed groups is concerned. The type of rhetoric, as you know, the non-state actors and the armed groups in the Middle East, some of them are traditional. They accept the nation state, the Westphalian nation state, and some of them do reject the international human law as well as international law. They shake off any Western idea. If I liaise with these groups, would it be possible to say that Article 51 stipulates this and that? They might shake their hands off and say, no, we don't believe in your articles. So it depends on the ideology and the creed of such armed groups. Do I have to have a different narrative? I, as an individual working for the ICRC, do I need to have a different approach? Do I need to match international law to the creed that they believe in? So we indeed followed some of these solutions in the Middle East, and it is indeed a social kind of experience that ought to be assessed at a later stage. This is the fourth phenomenon, the fifth phenomenon, and the last one, because the time is tight, the phenomenon of terrorism, the use of the term terrorism willy-nilly without any correct kind of definition. There are certain attempts to define terrorism, but the negotiations have faltered as far as the definition, the ultimate kind of definition of terrorism is concerned. The OIC and the 77, the group of 77 had crystal clear kind of position as far as terrorism definition is concerned. But IHL was able to plug this gap in incriminating all terrorist acts in accordance with the combating terrorism related conventions. But there is the international terrorism. The international terrorism is the father of all challenges, if I might say so, because it resembles a huge challenge. Here we're talking about terrorism that is different than the IHL's terrorism that has been defined by it. So there is a difference in the ideologies of those who perform or carry out the terrorism or terrorist acts. So the rhetoric must be different. The legislative philosophy is also different on the part of the international community. The international community looked at the terrorist organization or the so-called terrorist organizations as being enemies, and the anti-terrorism laws following the 11th of September deal with these terrorist organizations as being perpetual devil or eternal devil. So if we look at the IHL and its definition and being applied on anti-terrorism activities, then this would clash with the law itself, the anti-terrorism law that incriminates all the individuals of such groups. So this individual that belongs to any armed group will lose any incentive to resort to the IHL, because he will be ultimately a terrorist in accordance with the anti-terrorist law. And if he becomes a captive, he will be dealt with as a terrorist. In all cases, he will be designated and he will be dealt with as a criminal. And this is indeed a dilemma as far as IHL is concerned, and the NGOs who work in this domain. Most of the Security Council's resolution incriminate any funding of terrorism, and here we can indeed have to exert efforts in providing humanitarian aid to armed groups. Is this considered funding in the eyes of the aforesaid law? Because it is funding. So if I, for example, work for a humanitarian NGO and provide certain aid to the armed groups, am I a criminal? Will I be treated as a criminal? Will I be a terrorist? These are questions that we seriously want to overcome through negotiating with the UNGA and the United Nations, and we have been successful in some cases because resolutions have been passed in 2019 to apply the humanitarian exemption so that we can play a role as aid workers. So these are phenomena that I wanted to share with you, and there are numerous issues that we can talk about. I'd like to thank you for listening, and it was a pleasure to be with you, and I hope that we will liaise with you further to overcome all the challenges one day with your efforts. Thank you, and I'll move the floor to you, sir. Thank you.
شكرا جزيلا دكتور عمر.
شكرا جزيلا.
Thank you very much for emphasizing five, I think, of the most critical challenges we face in our region. And if you allow me just to summarize them very quickly, the excessive use of force. We started by mentioning this as a result of our report with PRIO. We have established now statistical evidence of this, that in our region we tend to use force far too quickly, both within the region and those intervening in our region. The fact that there is an increased presence of what Dr. Omar termed as hybrid conflicts, of the use of state and non-state working together, not necessarily within the one state, but also into neighboring states. The fact that most of conflict is now taking place in urban settings, which makes proportionality and the response principles particularly challenging to observe. And I think a very important point that we also started this evening with is the link to, or the need to allow communication regardless of the stand of the warring parties. And finally, the fifth, which is linked to number 4, is the trend of war on terror and terrorism and the challenges that all brought to us. While I wait for the audience to think of the questions, if you allow me just to start the panel discussion by tabling what I think is a very important issue within our region, or a grievance within our region, and that is most people believe that international law applies only to those who are weak. It seems that those who have the power can get away with breaking the law. And unfortunately, the continuous experience of Gaza and Israel demonstrate this on a daily basis, the occupation, etc. All of these are illegal, but they tend to continue and often unquestioned. And then we saw the war in Iraq and what that brought with it in terms of misery to the millions of individuals. And the United States and its allies went also off the hook without being held responsible. And that one argument is really what undermines a lot of the important issues that we talked about today, including the fact that many of those principles are really part of our religion and culture. They do not have to see them as something that came from the international community. It is how our religion has taught us to respect each other during the most difficult time of conflict. So I'd like to start maybe hearing from our panelists whether you see this as a dilemma. Is it something that you face on a day-to-day basis? It's not just about educating us, it's about carrying them along with you, convincing them that really this law applies to all equally. And if we have any examples that you can use to highlight this particular issue. I don't know who would like to start. Maybe we'll start with the practitioners, either Helen or Omar. Helen, can you hear us?
I can. Can you hear me, Chair?
Yes.
Great. Look, I'll just say a few words and then I will leave it to my very erudite colleague, Omar, because I have a pressing appointment with some ambassadors here. But what I wanted to flag was, I think it's a very important point you raise, and it's something the ICRC in our modalities are very strong about, the impartiality and the neutrality. And I can tell you, I speak very firmly and very clearly with heads of state and of course, foreign ministers and military commanders from every corner of the world, because everyone has a responsibility. The Geneva Conventions are the only universally ratified international treaty. Now, of course, we know that treaty law doesn't change human behavior, and as I think we've all said, there's heartbreaking examples in every conflict of breaches of these laws. But this important issue that it is something that everyone has a responsibility for, and in our experience, we've seen every side understanding the importance of IHL in different ways. It depends how we explain it, but also I think it is critical to put this in a non-political space and look at it as the needs for humanity. But I'll pass it to Omar for that, and I need to go in a couple of minutes, so I'll pass it to Omar for furtherance on that point. But thank you for raising it. It's fundamental, the equal application and the equal obligations. Thank you.
Thank you, Helen. I'd like to thank the chairperson. Indeed, this is the $1 million question, $1 million question in our Arab world. Unfortunately, we do witness IHL violations before our eyes. Okay. We do witness that with our eyes and through the media, through the television screens and other screens. The question is, there is a yawning gap between the theory and the practice. Yes, and we need to have a mechanism in place, a mechanism that can indeed play a major role to stave off any impunity. There are different assessments. There is the ICC, there are another courts that deal with such matters, and there are experts, but we, as the ICRC, play a role in raising awareness, but there are certain cases before the ICC, the Palestinian dossier, Sudan and Libya, and indeed cases are going on, but but I don't want to talk about the extent of success of such cases, but we as the ICRC need to have a national alternative. Indeed, in the region, we don't have a regional mechanism in the Arab world, unfortunately, to apply the IHL. Albeit there are some mechanisms like the Arab League, the OIC, and other organizations, the GCC Council, and so on and so forth, and they resort to the IHL preemptively. But what we are talking about here is to incriminate the action and to stave off any impunity, to avoid any impunity. So we need to have national legislations in order to customize the IHL nationally to incriminate the violations of IHL, as well as putting this within the framework of the National Criminal Code. And this will be a good substitute, a good alternative in the Middle East in order to overcome the culture of impunity. Because in the Arab world, despite our work in this region for more than 1.5 centuries, we do have meager legislations that incriminate the flagrant violations of IHL. So, pacta sunt servanta. This is the law here, and this is the bottom line. And I think that we need to have pacta. We need to have legislations in accordance with our national idiosyncrasy in order to incriminate the perpetrators of the most heinous crimes locally in our countries. And this is indeed very important, rather than blaming the NGOs or blaming the others for every single problem we have. This is the only alternative, indeed, and everybody is equal before the law, but we need the political will and not only just talk.
شكرا دكتور عمر. دكتور فوزي.
We need to differentiate between what we have and what we wish to have, and also we need to differentiate between the theory and the practice, and this is a problem when it comes to the law. As we are talking about IHL, I think IHL can resemble a traffic light. If the traffic light is not working and the cars pass through the traffic light that is not working, so where lies the blame? Is it to do with the driver, or is it to do with the traffic light that is out of order? This is a question of the chicken and egg, I think. We need, as a matter of fact, to customize the IHL, and sometimes the IHL is linked to the conduct of certain countries, and certain countries do have vested interests in here and there, and that's why some of the states do not apply the IHL because of certain interests, and hence we do notice that in Syria there is a proverb that says, read, you are joyous and you are happy, but when you implement it, then you will become miserable. So it's to do with walking the walk rather than talking the talk. So if you talk, you are happy, but when you walk in the walk, it is difficult. We as legal advisors are sometimes firm when we talk about these issues. But as a matter of fact, I would like to tell you an anecdote, albeit I'm a legal kind of person. There is a story here. A son has been born in some area, but rather than being joyous, the husband and the wife were at loggerheads with each other because of the name. Muhammad al-Tawil, Muhammad al-Saghir. They fought about the name. Then the grandfather called the Muhammad the Elastic. He joined between the two names. Thank you.
شكرا جزيلا. في معنا الآن تقريبا ربع ساعة تبقى لبعض الأسئلة. تفضل دكتور.
Please just stay to you. Dr. Abdul Fattah Mohammed, Senior Researcher at the Center for Conflict Studies and Humanitarian Work. Really very important things have been said, but we must not forget also that the nature of warfare has changed. Now wars are fought through drones and robotics. Therefore, consequently,
المسؤولية الآن تقع على من؟ هل تقع على الشخص الذي يقف خلف الجهاز كي يوجه الروبوت أو يوجه الدرونز التي قد تخطئ كما يخطئ الإنسان وتقضي على حياة أفراد كما رأينا في الكثير من الأوضاع التي جرى فيها استخدام هذه التقنيات على أنه أيضا هناك أنواع جديدة من الحروب أجيال جديدة من الحروب يوجد فيها حروب سبرانية وبالتالي هذه المساحة الجديدة من الحروب التي تخاض على هذا المستوى أيضا تحتاج ربما أن يكون القانون أيضا متزامنا أو متواكبا مع هذه النوعية الجديدة من التحديات وأن لا يبقى في نفس الخانة التقليدية التي كان عليها السابق.
شكرا دكتور. هناخذ مجموعة أسئلة وبعدين نرجع للبانل. منى.
Muna Hidayah, Research Fellow at CHS. First of all, I would like to thank all the speakers for their valued interventions. My question is to Dr. Omar Mikki. Actually, I'm wondering about the situation of the Palestinian prisoners that escaped from the Israeli prison, the Al-Bua prison. Especially after the arrest of 4 of them. What is the role of ICRC to protect their rights, to protect them, their families, and other prisoners under the international humanitarian law? Thank you.
Thank you, Muna. Take one more question. God, that's a long list from the social media. Okay, we'll take this one. Are there any instances where Islamic law has actually been used effectively in line with IHL and has resulted with a constraint of violence? So we have 3 questions. Who'd like to go for the one on drones? Maybe Omar.
Sorry, I have to lower the volume. Dr. Abdul Fattah, your question is important, really, pertaining to the criminal responsibility in using automatic weapons or autonomous weapons or the new types of drones and things. This is a new development we've been witnessing from around 2011 or thereabouts. We saw that in Yemen, then Afghanistan, and the Muslim world. We see that abundantly. And as you said, if it was possible to reach the person behind the controls, then this person will be responsible from the point of view of criminal law, will have criminal responsibility. But the important thing is we should all agree that using these weapons is allowed. There's not clear legally either to ban or not ban these weapons, but we should use them according to the Article 36 from the additional protocol. And so if the person in the control room, for example, targets a weapons depot in Hadramaut, then this should be or can be legitimate. But if, as a result of that, a school is destroyed, then this will be, here there'll be criminal liability for the person who's controlling the drone. Of course, when it comes to automatic weapons, much easier. When it comes to the autonomous weapon systems, which are, for example, the kind used for border control, and there's not a person there who controls them directly, and then the overall commander can be held responsible if that can be established. Of course, you'll see on the website of the International Criminal Court, for example, you cannot find or court orders to arrest specific persons because of the impossibility of that, but maybe the responsibilities for the overall command. The international humanitarian law as it stands is not enough to deal with these questions. As for the cyber warfare, the challenge is much bigger because establishing people who are responsible, because the maximum we can find is the IP address, but it will be very difficult to establish individual criminal responsibility and liability. So therefore, what we have in the international humanitarian law and other there, I think if you follow the events, you will find that the United Nations has a team of experts who are working on formulating new ways of dealing with cyber warfare. Thank God they are not widely spread in the Middle East, but at the level of the Russia or American confrontation, cyber warfare is evident. Dr. Fauzi. When it comes to Islamic jurisprudence, we'll find that it's very rich, in fact. In the Muslim world, there is what we call a smaller version or a miniature of Geneva Conventions, which Abu Bakr as-Sadiq, the first rightly guided caliph after Prophet Muhammad, he formulated that as I think our colleague from Kabul referred to that when she spoke about the recommendations by the Prophet, and also when we refer to jurisprudence books, we'll find a lot of chapters on the rules of warfare and jihad and the various schools of thought in Islam. This is widely available, but so far as practice is concerned, and it suffices to say that Abdul Qadir al-Jazairi was in Algeria, he fought a war of resistance. He has a lot of writings regarding the rules of fighting and his commands to the combatants. So therefore, the material is there and we can refer to. But the question was, in the recent past, has this been used or practiced, these principles, to convince people? Because the problem we have with the non-state actors, when they fight, they say they rely on the principles of Islam. There is a very pioneering experiment. I have my personal experience with Geneva Call, which is an NGO. I'm not advertising here, but I'm just mentioning facts. This is a Swiss organization which is concerned with the armed groups, and they try to find some texts to adapt that to the international humanitarian law. I attended a training course with them when a person comes from Geneva Call and says to someone, a member of the armed forces, to try and engage in a fight with a woman. The Afghani person says, no, this is against our traditions. The trainer says to him, this is also embodied in the international humanitarian law or the Geneva Protocols, as much as it's based in a religious text like a verse from the Quran or a saying by the Prophet. As for the texts themselves, I'm not sure there is, apart from the declaration by the International Islamic Cooperation, which was issued in the 80s, I think, in Cairo. It's mainly speaks in generalities and tries to adopt different opinions and tries to link them with some of the articles of the international.
Thank you so much. I'm afraid we've come to the end of our session. There are lots of questions. I will, if I may suggest that those online, maybe we can lean at Dr. Fauzi and Omar and ask them to try and respond to some of the questions online, if you don't mind. Later on, they will send them to you. But before we conclude, I would like our ambassador to maybe help us very briefly understand the association between Switzerland, ICRC, and the international humanitarian law. I mean, from what we heard so far, it's very important that the ICRC is as independent as possible and as neutral as possible. And we have seen over the years the pressure that is being put on ICRC and the Red Cross, Red Crescent community as a whole from some of the superpowers in various contexts. Can you just help us understand the role Switzerland plays in this?
With pleasure. Thank you very much for this question. Well, at the very outset, as it was mentioned, Henri Dunant, I mean, who was confronted with warfare in northern Italy in the 19th century, already started a tradition. And then, of course, after the Second World War, we have the Geneva Conventions. So, as a neutral, impartial country, I mean, it's part of the DNA of Switzerland. In addition to a peace city, humanitarian city like Geneva, to also host so many organizations, such as the ICRC and others. So my government continues to support in all international relevant fora the defense of these values, of these laws, and to further develop, leading with other like-minded countries, additional protocols, negotiation processes, and also, of course, events, symposia like the one we're holding tonight. So we are supporting and leading this effort together with ICRC, with all like-minded states and organizations, to actually tackle all these challenges that we have been talking about. I think it's very important to see that we do have, as was discussed, the international and also national legal framework, which are important to be enforced, but also an important part of specifically ICRC and the national governments and institutions are all the education efforts on all levels, not only with relevant ministries, with armies, but also with the youth, with children. And I think increasingly important is also campaigning in all kinds of fora, and probably in this modern age, including in social media. I mean, the good quality of our communication system nowadays, and that everyone nowadays has their mobile phones. You know, I think this is being done to spread these values. So it's a number of initiatives which go hand in hand. And of course, as was mentioned with the topic of the drones and cyber warfare, there are experts, as was mentioned, developing together with governments relevant rules to tackle these complicated issues. But again, Switzerland is supporting all these efforts. At the same time, of course, ICRC, they do have their independence. The president is a Swiss, but all the agents, this is a very international, independent organization. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I very much hope that amongst your like-minded countries, there are some Arab and Muslim countries who are, if not playing, could play a greater role in support of ICRC. Thank you all for participating in this seminar today. I think it's been incredibly insightful. We just maybe scratched the surface of the subject, but I'm very pleased that we could do this here in Doha, do it online, do it with experts from the Arab world who have a great experience. And I would like to thank all our panelists. I know you're all very busy people and you've given us a generous amount of time today. In particular, I would also like to thank Fatima Gailani. I know she's made a particular effort to be with us online from Kabul under very difficult circumstances, and I wish her all the best in her work for the Afghan people and on behalf of women in particular in Afghanistan. I also must express our gratitude to the fantastic team who's put this together, from the Swiss Embassy, from ICRC, from our center. Thank you to all those who've been involved. Thank you for our interpreters, the technical team, and hope to see you in our next event in a couple of weeks. Thank you very much for attending.